Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Sleazoids, the podcast where we go down the rabbit hole of 20th century genre fare, from the most influential canon classics to the trashiest exploitation films we can get our hands on, and invite you to tag along in helping us create a canon of sleaze. Each week is a double feature grindhouse style where we discuss two films loosely related by subject, genre, actor, filmmaker, or franchise. And at the end of each episode, along with our honorary Sleazoids, which you can become by subscribing on Patreon,
we're getting witchy next week. Join the sleaze.
we decide on all the official ratings and rankings for every film that we cover. Patreon subscribers also get an on-air shout-out and 2 bonus episodes every single month, which we have been doing for almost 3 years.
Yeah.
So there is something like 60, 70 plus bonus episodes, as well as our bonus transmission series, where we're still talking about new release genre films, usually about once a month. So if you haven't made the jump yet, patreon.com/Sleazoids podcast, I'd recommend doing that. And speaking of which, we did have a lot of people make the jump this week, so I'm going to rip through those as fast as I can here. We have Glenn Dixon, DVS, Morgan Geyer, Sean Barrett, Alec Nelson. Scrolling up, because we're still going here, we have Aiden Andrewchow, who is a longtime patron. He upgraded actually to the $10 a month, so he's going to be joining us for the $10 a month virtual screenings that we do once a month. I haven't still decided on that title yet. Maybe I will, though, by the time you guys are listening to this. But yeah, once a month, Jamie and I, we react to a movie live with you guys. So if you want to do that, $10 a month. So thanks to Aiden for doing that. Other people who have signed up, we have John Curitsis. This is the listen to Josh pronounce your name wrong opening of every episode, so I hope you enjoyed that. We have B-Fly, Caleb Cunningham, Benjamin Cuthrell, Alex Walsh, Andrew Kriegbaum, Drew Taylor, Nuiho. That's everyone.
Awesome.
Amazing.
Wow, thanks, guys.
We did it.
Yeah, that was awesome.
Lots of new patrons this week, so thanks to you guys for signing up. Hope you guys are enjoying all the bonus content. That's the one plug for the week. The other plug, as always, is Apple Podcasts. If you guys are listening on Apple Podcasts, and I see the stats, I know that you're listening on Apple Podcasts right now while listening to this, scroll to the bottom, give us a good old rating and review down there. It helps us climb the ranks at iTunes and find new listeners. We had someone give us a good old 5-star review this week that just said, "The boys." So
damn right, very kind.
Thank you, big old, was it Groupie 100? Thank you, brother.
Something like that, yeah.
And the last plug, a new plug, we have merch now.
Yeah.
If you guys really like the show and you like the poster artwork that horror artist Trevor Henderson did for us on the show, it's kind of what appears in your feed there. That logo art for us can be put on just about anything, on hoodies, on shirts, on mugs, on masks, whatever. You can find the link to all of the merch in the description of this episode here or on sleazoidspodcast.com. And okay, these intros, man, they're getting long. Welcome back, everyone. As always, I am your host, Josh Lewis, and joining me also, as always, my co-host,
Jamie Miller. Welcome back, everybody.
Yeah, I think 2 weeks ago would have been the last time you guys, free listeners, would have heard from us, and we would have wrapped up 2020 by talking about the best genre movies of the year. It was kind of a weird year for everyone, and especially the film industry, but there were new release movies that were coming out, and some of them were genre movies, and some of them were very good. And Jamie and I got to count down both of our top 10s. We had a lot of great feedback, and I saw a lot of people who are in the Discord and that we follow on Letterboxd watch listing some of the stuff that we were talking about. So that was pretty cool to see.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if you haven't heard that episode, that was the free episode for everyone 2 weeks ago. And then last week over on the Patreon, we talked about John le Carré, who recently passed away, and he was one of the greatest espionage novelists just of all time. A lot of his work has been adapted in some really incredible films, and we talked about one of them especially. We talked about The Spy Who Came In From the Cold from 1965 by Martin Ritt.
So sad.
Which is a very, very bleak and brutal depiction of sort of like the soul-crushing mundanity of international espionage. And then we also talked about The Russia House from 1990, which is a little bit of a more romantic version of a John le Carré adaptation. But Sean Connery and Michelle Pfeiffer are both very good in it, and it has definitely some interesting ethical and moral questions raised.
Some beautiful cinematography as well.
Definitely. But yeah, moving on. Oh, wait, sorry. But yeah, that was last week's bonus episode for anyone who happened to miss out on that. Patreon.com/Sleazoids podcast if you'd like to hear that one. But moving on to this week, we have a very special guest joining us. He is an American politics and Middle Eastern geopolitics journalist and writer and the affairs editor at Watchdogs Gazette. And he also happens to be a bit of a film, and especially a silent era film, enthusiast. So we have joining us Séamus Malekafzali. Séamus, how you doing?
Hey guys. I'm doing wonderful.
Good.
Glad to be on the pod.
Yeah, thanks for coming on and for bringing on a kind of film we actually have yet to talk about. And it feels crazy because we're 3 years into the show and just no one's brought it on and we haven't thought to do it yet. But you have brought with you a silent film double feature going back to the early days before things were even really called horror films. But both of these are now, in retrospect, deemed horror films. So what is the double feature that you've brought with you this week, and why do they pair together?
The two films that I brought on are The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and The Hands of Orlak. The former made in 1920 and the latter made in 1924. Both of these films are directed by Robert Vine. Both of these really engage with German expressionism, abject psychological terror, lots of crazy production design, set design, visual effects as well, atmospheres of just utter dread. It's really, really great films that pair very well together, I think.
Definitely. And Cabinet of Dr. Caligari especially, that this is considered sort of a... it's one that when you first study German expressionism in school, if anyone's ever done anything like that, it's one of the first movies that you will watch and you will talk about. So it's kind of cool to finally get around to this on the show. I probably first watched it in like 2011 or 2012. So I've seen it like 3 or 4 times now, and it was cool to bring it on the show because, again, this is back before anyone really knew to call something horror. But they are absolutely both horror films and have inspired horror films for 100 years now, which is insane to think about.
You guys know what they would call them back in that time? Was it as simple as just like comedy, tragedy, or just like what
No.
did they have genres in a sense?
I did actually read some reviews of Hands of Orlak where it was referred to as a thriller, believe it or not.
Oh, okay, very cool.
Which is which was kind of cool.
Yeah.
But yeah, that being said, I think we are just going to jump right into these. We are going to start off with The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. All right, we are talking about the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, the 1920 German silent horror film, exactly 100 years old, which is kind of nuts. Directed by Robert Wein, or also Robert Wien. I've heard a lot of the German critics who I was watching interviews. That's how they pronounced it.
Okay.
But it is written by Hans Hanowitz and Karl Mayer. Again, this is considered sort of like one of the essential works of German Expressionism, which we've talked about. We covered once on this show because we did Fritz Lang's M, which is a little bit later in the period of Expressionism. Expressionism kind of was more of a 20s, obviously the entire movement carried over and inspired a lot of film just in general, but Fritz Lang's earlier work I think is considered more expressionist, things like Destiny and Metropolis, than necessarily M is. But we had to cover it a little bit because it is just one of the most influential not just film movements, but like artistic movements of the early 1900s, including like visual art, like painting and theater design and literature, a lot of art forms that, people moved over into film, especially after World War I in Germany, which left the country very insulated and economically kind of ruined, and they had to kind of start their own film industry. I think we talked about it on the M episode, but like, I believe they went from making something like 5 films a year to 150 films a year in in just a couple of years. And the filmmakers
I believe it.
were given a lot of artistic freedom to experiment, and a lot of them were ingesting a lot of the expressionist visual art of the time, which they then took into the design and the production of their films with these very stark style choices, using shadows and using very fantastical set design, just to psychologically and emotionally express, things that the characters are feeling, using compositions and mise en scène and sets and just about everything. And it really got at feelings for a, sort of chaotic, there's a very chaotic form for chaotic times in Germany in particular, and it very much expressed a lot of their, fears and paranoias and fantasies, and Caligari is a very good one to start off with because it is absolutely one of the most insane when it comes to the visual and set design elements for this movement. But very broadly, the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari stars Werner Krauss as Caligari, and Conrad Veit as a character named Caesar. And these two characters, Caligari is kind of a showman at a local fair who is unveiling his, I didn't look up actually how to pronounce this, Somnambulus? Is that
I think so, yeah. I was surprised that it was just as complicated in German as it was in English.
Yes.
It's a very bizarre term to use, and not just like sleepwalker, which is what it means.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, like literally it's just a man who is considered so deep in sleep that he might as well be dead, but his sort of subconscious is able to be manipulated to have him do physical movements, and that's sort of the suggestion. And so it has a little bit of a Dr. Frankenstein and the monster relationship between Caligari and Caesar. And meanwhile, there is a character named Francis, who has a friend named Alan, who's in a bit of a love triangle with another character named Jane, who happen to attend this fair and see this monster awoken as he is about to unleash a lot of death upon Germany. And so very broadly, that's kind of like the story we're going to track here. We're going to get into some of the twists and turns of the story, because this does actually, both of these films are actually surprisingly plot heavy. When it comes to getting across some of these character journeys, but the thing that does impress, I think, most about Caligari is just the really, really creepy vibe that is given off from the strange angles and the twisting architecture and the sort of like voodoo horror vibe you get from the story itself.
Very dark piano score as well, which I noticed. It really most of the film has a very dark sense to it when it comes to the musical score. When they're at the fair, they'll have something a little bit more upbeat, like at first, but then everything goes to hell. So right away, we're dealing with like really tense strings and very sad, kind of melancholic piano, and it's very effective. It's really good.
Definitely.
Yeah, you brought up the set design, but it really it becomes so much more impressive when if you've looked back at any of the films the major films that were released in the 1910s. There isn't any. You don't see films with set design like this. Now. But before then, even with the few proto-horror films that had been released then, it looks fairly typical. Maybe some Victorian settings, but the Victorian settings look very real. But, in this movie, the desk clerks have chairs that are higher than their actual desks. None of the walls seem to fit with one another. They slant, they go up. The houses look like they're cartoons almost, but they have doors on them that you can go inside. They were clearly constructed,
I love how
you have interiors.
And the scaling is all like incorrect. Like sometimes the real people populating it will look like giants in the land, or sometimes when you go to an interior, like they will look absolutely dwarfed. The set like kind of like looms over them, or there will just be geographic spaces that just don't make any sense. Like the police station, when the dudes are sitting on chairs that are like 12 feet tall, you're like, how did they even get up there? Or doorways don't even make sense for a person to be able to fit through them or anything. Like the entire world is absolutely like tilted and basically
it looks like it's
sort
melting.
of it's disfigured by the sort of like fear and paranoia that the characters are feeling. And it's worth noting too that both the writers of the film here were they came up with the idea for the film by they were both pacifists during World War I, and both of them actually feigned being insane or like having gone mad to avoid fighting. And they were forced to see military psychologists throughout the war. And so when they got back, the title character here is actually based on their experiences, being forced to go to essentially therapy sessions with military psychologists, where and as a result, they've kind of created this madman who is not only wreaking disruptive violence throughout German society, but as is later revealed in the film, he's actually a respected sort of institutional figure, a figure of power and authority and with control over others. Which is sort of realized in the exaggerated mind control Frankenstein horror form, but then also in sort of like the character's mind and the expressionist imagery that is used to depict his mind breaking down. The entire set's also drawn on like canvases that look like you could tear through them. Like it looks like the world's gonna fall apart at any second, and like even characters like wear their hats like tilted askew. There's like carousels that look like they're tilted in a way that makes no sense.
Yeah, they even put some strange makeup on Caligari himself to make him look even older and more like a madman, because later on when we see him in a more normal situation, he actually does just kind of look like a normal older man. And I do really like the effects that they put on his face, and it really matches with kind of what you see on the walls as well when they're like that one shot. I think it's actually the poster on Letterboxd where he's just going down the alleyway, and the buildings are also like they're just very strangely painted to make them kind of look like buildings, but that you're like locked inside of a painting or something like that.
Definitely.
Yeah, and I think the makeup is a good segue point for Conrad Veidt's character, which is introduced in the first act. Conrad is one of my favorite actors that I think I've ever seen.
We're going to be talking about him in both films here.
Yeah, he's amazing.
Yes, wonderfully. And everything, the acting alone is enough to really sell how absolutely terrifying this man is. But the makeup really emphasizes just how gaunt he looks unwell. He looks like he's on the verge of death constantly. But even though he looks like, theoretically, maybe you could just push him over and he'd shatter. Just even when he, like, I mean, you know the scene I'm talking about where he opens his eyes for the first time, and it just brings him in on a close up, and it's so slow. But I've never seen a scene where someone opens their eyes depicted so horrifyingly, and you feel as if you might the character might get killed just by like that look that Conrad gives when
he has very concentrated facial expressions, very mechanical, almost like very I guess you would call it kind of like intentionally overacting for what you wouldn't necessarily have to do like you would in the theater, where you can have these really intense stylish close-ups of him, but he's still doing these really huge acting moments, and also not just his face but his body movements. He has these very odd, he has this very lanky form to him, but it's still kind of like sharp and angular, and he moves with a sense of danger to it almost. And I was told actually while studying it at the time that he was actually trained in a lot of very specific uncommercial dance styles in order to do some of the body movements that he does in this, so that his motions were meant to create this feeling of unreality in the same way that you get from seeing painting forms of lights and shadows directly onto a set. Like, it doesn't look real, and his performance is supposed to replicate that in a way to kind of create this sense of, not just in the images, but in the way that the actors move, you get this kind of like fun house sideshow kind of stylization to it, which is notably different than the more realistic performances that are being given by like Francis and Jane and the Alan characters, who are mostly reacting to this horrifying situation.
Yeah.
Oh, sure. And I mean, even though there's a lot of, I don't want to say theatricality to Veidt's performance in this, he does a lot of huge moves and outbursts and all these different things, but there's so much subtlety in his facial movements, lots of little cues and details to make it real. It's not, I mean, a lot of actors from this very, very early period had theater training. They knew that they had to make their facial expressions gigantic so that people could see in the back, but you didn't need to do that. Not a lot of actors that I've seen, maybe in Intolerance, for example, did maybe a couple people get it, but I think this is the earliest film that I've seen where everybody is on the same page about what film can do. And
definitely.
What your face can do, and Conrad, I mean, obviously at the front of the pack, knows exactly what mix of things to do, and it's really wonderful.
Yeah. There's even the consistency, like the just the realization of what kind of film you're in. The consistency of the set designs themselves, I think, are just incredible. To go from, like that painting they show of the city, and it's got all the kind of melted, tilted buildings, and then they go into the alleyway where people are walking, and it still has that very dreamlike and weird architecture. And then they have things where they go into like the doctor's office, like we were talking about, with the giant chairs and all the books everywhere and stuff. It's just, or Dr. Caligari's house, that strange small little tilted thing he has. There's just a real consistency to everything in this film that really just kind of expresses the world and sets you in it. It's impressive. I just can't believe it's 100 years old. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, and it's worth noting too that in the structure of the film, because the film opens on like Francis and an old man sort of like sitting on a bench, and the old man's talking about like spirits that have like abandoned him, and his fiancée Jane approaches him and he tells a story about how they got there, and so this is all framed in a sense of sort of character subjectivity, and it sets it up for you to know that. But you do think that, he is, from what we see in the opening of the scene, he seems like a normal guy. You think that he's just telling an old man a story.
Right. The one odd thing you kind of get is when he says that his fiancée passes, she seems like she's in this weird kind of trance, like a hypnosis in a way.
Yes.
And that's like the one little hint that you get that something's off. But other than that, it sets it up pretty normally.
Yeah, and the story that he tells is just of himself and his friend named Alan, who attend the fair that Dr. Caligari is showing off he's showing off Conrad, this Caesar, this monster that he has, who he awakens from, as is sort of quote unquote in the film, his death-like trance. And he's obviously got a lot of the makeup that we've been talking about on him, and he's given life. He has like these clawed hands, but also he's given this sort of like supernatural mysticism to him, where he knows every secret. He sees the past and the future. Like, step up and ask him a question. And Alan goes up to him and says, how long will I live? Just a question you probably just never want the answer to. You just shouldn't ask it in the first place. But Conrad tells him, until the break of dawn, which kind of freaks them out a little bit for obvious reasons. No. And that kind of sets everything in motion, because Alan is later found dead that night. There's a couple sequences in between, you know, where we get to see them sort of walking around the town at night, and sort of like some of these strange feelings that people are having, and sort of like the confusion and turmoil that is, you know, just in the locations that these characters are walking through. But you get soon after Alan being killed in one of the creepiest sequences in the film, where Alan is in this room that again makes no sort of logistical sense, because like the room is so massive, and also his bed seems like too big for him. Like it's just weirdly kind of like scaled, and the reason it's framed to make, you know, Alan look so small, and some of the room seems so vast, is obviously to dwarf him as a character and his powerlessness. But then soon after, the shadows hit the wall, and you see the clawed hands in the shadow, and you see him literally be strangled to death on a shadow on the wall. And it is very, very creepily and well made.
These kind of sequences reminded me of, now I haven't seen it, but I've just seen tons of clips over the years. Nosferatu. When did that come out? Was that a couple years afterwards?
1922.
Okay, because it just reminded me of like those, you know, the claws, the shadows on the wall, the kind of the stalking, that kind of creepiness. And also just the imagery of Conrad in the coffin is very Dracula-esque as well. But yeah, I just thought
the Universal monster movies very famously stole a lot of their stuff that they do in their movies and their style from the German Expressionists, for sure.
There is even like later on, and we'll get to the details, but like when he's running away from kind of like the villagers after he's stolen somebody, it's very much like Frankenstein again and all that. So
yeah.
I don't think this was the first horror, not necessarily a horror film, but just a film to do the kind of the shadows about to attack. If I remember, J'accuse, directed by Abel Gance, which is also one of my favorite films. There's a scene where a woman is attacked by German soldiers, and it never shows the actual German soldiers, but it shows their heads appearing on the wall in silhouette, and they have the spiked helmets, so you know, and then they all move to go in, and then that's what it cuts. But that was, I think, a year before this. But it was still very new as a cinematic technique.
Definitely. Yeah. A lot of these techniques were being invented by a lot of people during this time period. But this does, in terms of like sort of like keeping it in line with German Expressionism, this does predate a lot of the films in the German Expressionist movement, like things like Nosferatu or The Last Laugh, talking about Maure Murnau, or even like Pabst's like Secret of the Soul. And obviously we already mentioned Lang with Destiny and Metropolis and other things like that. And these films, obviously, as a collective, went on to basically invent what we now refer to as horror image making. Monster movies, the surrealist works of the 40s and 60s. These people inspired Hitchcock and noir, and anything that is, you can probably deem a psychologically subjective character study that scares you. You could probably trace it back in some way to the German Expressionists and this film. And this is one of the earliest examples. So this film, every time I watch it, I am continually like impressed with something new about it. And I, every time I'm watching a film, I'm like, oh yeah, I've seen that.
Yeah, for sure. There was a ton of that.
Yeah, but the thing that I think I'm the most taken with is specifically that subjectivity that you feel in this film as he's telling the story, because as we sort of like move our way through a little bit further through the film, because we got to get to the big twist moment, which I think is just honestly one of my favorite twists in movie history.
They're still using it.
Oh god, it saved the movie for me. I mean, it was already great, but then it became fantastic. Like, so good.
Well, I just find it incredible that and we'll get to it in detail, but the twist itself is still being used 100 years later over and over and over again. I mean, just the number of horror movies that have done that specific twist is unreal. So to see it 100 years ago was very impressive.
Yeah, definitely. But there's a lot of, after obviously Alan is killed, it is a lot of Francis and Jane kind of, trying to figure out what exactly is going on, who has been killing people. That they're talking about someone who is prowling the night with some sort of sharp instrument, and the environment itself almost looked like it has like knives sticking out of it. It looks like, again, it's going to break down or swallow a character at any given second. But Francis, he won't rest until he gets to the bottom of those dreadful deeds, whatever they are. And he, he's turns into a little bit of procedural as he starts telling people to suspect Caligari, but Caligari is sort of covering his tracks by having like a dummy version of the monster that sits inside the little coffin that he's pretending, my monster went back to sleep when I told him to go back to sleep, even though we know that he's out there prowling the night, like when he kidnaps Jane in that really horrifying sequence where he grabs her from her own bed and like drags her through the window and through the streets until the people have to stop him from doing that.
Yeah.
Which is, Jamie's right, that is very much, they stole that basically right from Frankenstein with like the villagers coming for him and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But eventually he traces Caligari all the way to an insane asylum. And you realize that, I mean, the whole movie itself has kind of felt like wandering this like surreal asylum. So it's very fitting by the time you get there. But he finds out that Caligari is actually the director of the asylum, who became obsessed with this old tale of a doctor and essentially his sleepwalking Frankenstein. And so when someone who, is a sleepwalker is admitted to his hospital, he essentially goes mad with the idea of turning him into that monster and turning himself into Caligari. And his madness, it's implied, has sort of like infected the entire world, and sort of in the structure of the film, it has merged again this institutional figure, which we have been dealing a lot with, because you'll find that Francis spends a lot of time, going to the cops and trying to get help from them, and trying to overpower this character who he thinks is there. But then he finds out this is one of the most powerful figures in his entire town. And also that person is a fucking murderous like showman. And so the line between sort of like an idea of political power and sanity and sort of sadism have basically all been effectively shattered at this moment. And that shot too, where Cross basically just like starts sitting up in his chair, looking directly like into the camera, essentially.
Oh yeah.
It's horrifying, and it happens at the exact moment where you get the plot realization, and it's so matched in this image of him just like being like, "That's right."
This act is so. I mean, it's. I mean, this whole movie is great, start to finish. But like the start of the act, the end of the act is really just amazing. I want to go back to the scene where Caesar goes to kidnap, or I guess he means to kill Jane, because I've watched a lot of horror movies. I've watched a lot of silent movies. I have never seen a scene like an attempted murder scene like that in a film done so perfectly, in a way. The lighting, I mean, the way that it's shot is really lost on a lot of prints that I think is on Tubi or Prime, because it's in black and white. But if you get the right version with the right tinting, it's this icy blue.
Yeah.
And you see Veidt. I mean, he's kind of like dancing around the alleyway to get into the house, but then you see Jane in the foreground, and in the background You see Caesar just creep out. It's very slow, and
the composition is like half the frame is like her giant bed, and the other half is like that really geographically strange like window that he has come through as he's slowly approaching her. Again, it's just a weird way where it's directing your eyes to look at it, but the space itself, again, it just makes so little sense that it feels weird and off even before you have a creepy figure slowly approaching her.
And also the shot composition, not only about the production design. I mean, obviously dolly shots, close-ups, that had all been pioneered years before, but Vine keeps it steady. He forces you to watch Vite just very slowly walk up. There are no cuts. There are no breaks in time. You just have to watch and wait for him to finally make his move, and it's fantastic suspense, and I love it a lot.
Yeah,
it's great. It's wonderful.
Definitely. Yeah, there's a lot of that, because if there's one thing I'll say about this film is that, I mean, in comparison to, we've talked about Lang on the show in particular, and Lang is someone we've talked about a lot in terms of his some of his editing patterns and structures, and like this has a very sort of like simple, I mean, some might accuse it of being like a little dry or linear in a sense to the way that it moves through its scenes, but there is something that does build to that suspense, because it almost doesn't need to be sort of like weirder or more odd in terms of the cutting, because what you're watching is so
I think being in the space itself is enough. Absolutely.
Yeah, just the camera firmly planted still in a room that looks like how the rooms look like in this.
Yeah,
feels insane.
Oh, yeah, just fills you with like dread. Like what is gonna come out of these walls? And of course, every single time it's something horrifying.
Yeah, well, and not to mention, like it gets crazy too, because I mean, as again we move from the monster sort of like failing to kill Jane, and I think it's implied that the monster kind of like he seems to, I don't know if he ran out of battery power or what happens to him, but he kind of collapses, and it's sort of implied because Caligari, hasn't been with him, taking care of him, and he's basically, has that life has ended for that reason, which is kind of actually a weirdly sad moment, even though he's been such a disruptive, violent force. But it speaks to the inhumanity of Caligari, who creates life and then completely abandons it. But when, again, we get to the big asylum, and the asylum, again, it doesn't look like what I imagine any normal asylum at the time looked like. And Caligari, reveals himself. There's this insane scene where he... I think it's supposed to be a bit of a flashback where we are getting, it's kind of like the one sort of like time jump that we get in the film, where it's a little bit expository of them, reading the doctor's journal about his experience of him slowly losing his mind, thinking that he is now this Dr. Caligari, this old sort of mythological tale figure that he's heard about. But that scene where he's walking around outside, and all he sees is like literally writing starts to appear on the walls and the sets around him saying, you must become Caligari.
Yeah.
And he might as well have been going like, I am going to become the Dr. Caligari.
Yeah.
I mean, he literally says, I must become Caligari.
Yeah,
he literally says
the original Joker, baby.
Those words are what pop up, and it's funny too because the text looks like it's actually like attacking him at one point or something, like it's surrounding him and it's just going nuts. It's great.
Yeah, the environment around him is changing.
Yeah,
which is something that's just really, really insane. And they eventually show him, I think, Caesar's corpse and take him away in a straitjacket where he becomes sort of like an inmate in his own asylum. And they start throwing him in like this giant warped looking cell, and you honestly think that could be the end of the film. That the big twist was you know, that the sort of like creepy ass Frankenstein P.T. Barnum dude ends up being sort of a respected institutional figure in town. And you're like, that's a twist enough.
Yeah, that's scary in itself.
But then it turns out Francis was actually, the entire time this story has been from his subjective point of view that he's been telling us. And they told us this up front, so we should have known that it was coming. But he is actually a patient in the asylum, and Jane and Caesar are actually just fellow patients with him under the real Dr. Caligari, who appears to just be a real, normal psychologist. And the entire film that we've been watching is actually this sort of like fictional adventure story of him being the hero who stopped a crazed murderer, when instead we've been witnessing basically the ramblings of a sick man who is shouting at his doctor, "You all think I'm insane, but it is he, the director, Caligari, who is insane."
So
and then weirdly enough, though, is that they don't let you sit with that moment without a little bit of ambiguity, because the last line of the film is actually, "He thinks I am the mystic Caligari. Now I know how to cure him." And you're sitting there going, what does that mean?
Yeah, they even have that really ominous kind of like a vignette zoom in on his face, and it doesn't exactly appear innocent. I will say that.
No, well, and the whole time too, I think what's important is that the film has built to this kind of general distrust of authority and institutional figures. So even though this man does look unwell and kind of insane shouting at the doctors, there is something just sort of creepy even when you return to the realism of the real asylum, and you're left with feelings of like people having control over other people. And that's something that is scary. That is something that is, you know, when it comes to not just Francis' character, but also the character of Caesar, who Caligari spends the film, you know, sort of unleashing him as a killer. So this idea of sort of like this vague idea of mind control and also authority, where people have more power than other people, those general feelings have been used to make you kind of afraid for the majority of the runtime. So by the time you hit this end and you're watching what should just be, oh yeah, he's a crazy man and the doctor is trying to take care of him, but you know, what can you do? And instead you're left with this feeling of kind of like, the doctor still kind of weirds me out, even though I've left the dream, even though they've shattered the dream. There's just something very off-putting about, you know, someone having that kind of power over someone else.
Yep.
I mean, we're all agreed we love this ending. But for me, one of the reasons why I like it so much is because there are these little moments throughout the movie where it doesn't detract from my enjoyment whatsoever, at least in the first viewing. But when he discovers the book that explains like exactly how Dr. Caligari came to be, like I thought, oh, that's kind of awfully convenient, but okay, it's kind of spooky and all these different things, and like how everybody's at just the convenient place and all these things. But then when it's revealed that it's the insane ramblings of a man, as you said, who thinks that he's the hero, it makes perfect sense. Because if you were the hero in your own story, why would you not make yourself the exact center where everything is spelled out for you and you can easily find it? And
why wouldn't the evil man leave a diary about how evil he was?
That's what you read in stories. That's what you think would happen if this were to happen to you, and it's just it's fantastic writing. It's great.
It was the original Google search scene.
Exactly. Yeah, the thing that I actually do appreciate, though, because that you're right, that is like a very blatantly sort of like expository moment in a film that otherwise doesn't necessarily feel that way. What I do kind of appreciate, and this also takes us actually to something that is obviously exclusive to silent cinema, is that even the title cards are designed to be like kind of like handwritten and strange.
Oh yeah,
and
it's
green.
Great.
Like there's like a sickly feeling to them as well, for sure.
Definitely, and I kind of got that feeling too when he was like just showing us the images of him reading the diary, for example. Like even the writing and the the graphic design of what they're still showing you still feels unhinged. It feels like the ramblings of a madman.
Yeah.
And even just the way that the lettering is like wrong. Like, it's not the way that like anyone would actually hand write something. Like, it matches the kind of like sharp and bizarre kind of like cubist visual art kind of thing that they're going for at the same time. So
yeah, it never lets you escape that kind of that imagery and feeling.
Yeah.
Definitely. But yeah, pivoting, I think, towards the reductive rating round, which is where we, for you, Séamus, we remove all the words and all the nuance and reduce the movie between a number between 1 and 5. But we also make it closing statements and any scenes or notes that you had written down that we didn't get a chance to hit to. We also hit them here. But CALIGARI, it should probably be no surprise. This one is the 5 for me. This, I think, is just one of the most important works when it comes to essentially establishing, what would go on to become horror. One of, obviously just a favorite genre of the Sleazoids boys here. This is one of the most important works for visually establishing a lot of the techniques that would go on to define what horror would be. I mean, the most popular, like, I think when horror actually became a term that people used, it was around the time of Universal Monsters, to describe sort of like monster movies, because the subject matter was just as horrifying rather than just necessarily the style. But all of those movies directly pulled from this. It directly pulled from this, and it also directly pulled from other German expressionist movies at the time. But as we've mentioned, I think just that the way that the sort of like jagged and bizarre design work that is like chaotic and unhinged, and the twisting architecture and the sort of like fragmented streets that people walk in, the way that it sometimes makes no architectural or geographic sense with the people in it, it really does reflect the psyche of a confused society torn by violent madness. Even the grass sticking out of the ground looks like knives sticking out about to stab someone. And the way that's sort of like abstract, strange sort of cubist insanity is all applied to a real psychological experience that you go through with this character, and also hitting on themes of sort of like institutional power and the idea of sort of like the subjectivity of the human mind, and how it gets all through all of that almost entirely visually is insane. And again, the performances and the makeup also feel dreamlike and unreal. I gotta say, this is just definitely one of my favorite silent era films.
Yeah, for me right now it's at that like high 4, but I'll be revisiting this, I think, a lot over the years to come. I absolutely love the imagery here. It does feel like the city was kind of designed in a way where it didn't, like, they didn't want you to feel comfortable or at home in the city. It's just constantly changing. There's just never any consistency to it, and it adds to that kind of abstract feeling and the subjectivity of the story and the perspective of Francis. But yeah, it's just this was incredible. Also love the score. It's incredibly dark and sad piano. Loved the imagery that kind of reminded me of Frankenstein and Dracula, a little bit of Nosferatu as well. And to see like that kind of twist ending that's still being done 100 years later is just genuinely impressive, and really says, I think, a lot about writers nowadays. Not all, of course, but the amount of things that I saw in this film that I still see and today, but not done in any different way is honestly just, it's shocking.
You will never watch Shutter Island the same way, that's for sure.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, this is great, and I have to say, I absolutely love Conrad. Is it Veidt? I
think it's Veidt.
Okay.
Veidt.
Because now, like with Hands of Orlac, which we're about to talk about, he's fantastic. But I also watched The Man Who Laughs a few months ago, and just his,
yeah, that's great.
Yeah, he just has such a vulnerability to the way that he performs, and yeah, like his lankiness kind of helps with that and everything. And And I just wanted to mention him because I think I'll be diving into some of his films, the ones that I haven't seen. I just see that he's actually in Casablanca as well, which is a big blind spot for me. So anyway, yeah, really impressed with this, and I will be watching this probably over and over again, to be honest. So yeah, 4 out of 5 for now.
His performance and the design on him are especially good. Even though I also think that Werner Krauss, who we didn't get to talk about quite as much, his he's incredible. Top hat and glasses and strangly gray hair.
Yeah, and he does a lot of they'll do close-ups of his face, and he's always kind of moving his mouth in these weird ways, and it's just he has a very strange presence to him, and it's really good, really effective.
For me, I mean, I'm gonna agree with Josh here. 5 out of 5, completely.
Nice.
It's so. I mean, everything that needs to be said has been said already about this, but set design is really unmatched. I mean, even to some respects, even today, especially with the silent era.
Yeah, our words actually can't even describe it. For anyone who hasn't seen the scene, just look up screenshots of this movie to get an idea of what we're talking about. But words literally can't do it justice.
Yeah, I'm actually looking at one of the screenshots of just the on-set where they're in Caligari's house, and it's just 3 guys and the coffin, and they can barely fit in it because of just how small it is. It's great.
I mean, just impeccable acting from everyone involved, such tight writing, such a defined vision of what you want, what Vine wants the film to be. He got the film to be. It's truly, literally every single thing that I thought that I wasn't going to like about the movie, however few, was immediately justified by the end. Just fantastic. Mm-hmm. I can't recommend it enough. But make sure that you get the right tinted copy, because if you watch the black and white copy that is more widely available, completely distracts from the film. You need to
definitely look up, because the copy you're referring to, I think, was the 4K restoration that Kino Lorber did a couple years ago.
Yeah.
So they put out a Blu-ray of the film that I have, and people can find probably that copy available to stream somewhere. But that's definitely the copy that you want to watch, because also just the 4K restoration they did of the original negatives, which were mostly preserved somehow, is very, very good. The quality on it is fantastic, and it only lends itself to you to be able to see more of its sinister, distorted style that it has.
Yeah.
And great.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that'll wrap it up for the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. We are going to be right back, and we are going to be talking about The Hands of Orlok. All right, we are back, and we are talking about The Hands of Orlok, the 1924 Austrian silent horror film directed once again by Robert Wien and starring, once again, Conrad Veidt this time.
Oh, yeah.
Alongside some different performances here by Alexandra Sorina and Fritz Strassny. But Conrad in this film is playing a world-famous pianist named Paul Orlok, which is where we're gonna, he has the titular hands.
Yes.
But what happens is that he loses those hands in this sort of freak train accident that takes place, and his wife, who realizes that his hands, obviously being a piano player, are his living and is their life. He needs to get hand replacements, so he actually gets a surgeon to transplant new hands for him, but it turns out that those hands might have a dark past.
Yeah.
that he is horrified to learn about, and a lot of the film ends up being sort of like this another sort of like paranoid horror story where you're not entirely sure if he is the one losing his mind thinking about the hands, or if the hands are possibly actually possessed, taken over his body and wanting him to kill. But right off the jump, the thing that's, I guess, sort of noticeably different about this, especially for on part of the directing, is that this film, in terms of its sort of shooting, its sets and its locations, is more noticeably realistic. In terms of scenes in people's houses, and in terms of scenes, early on in the film where, we do get a shot of sort of like trains colliding, and people sort of driving cars through the night. And even though, they're still lit in a way, we some harsh lights and done with some dolly tracking shots of the cars and things like that. They're still done in a way that's still stylistically creepy, but there are no twisting, strange architectural buildings quite like there are in Caligari. And the actual surrealism actually makes its way into the realistic spaces. And there are some scenes where they do some elements with the sets and with the lighting to make it feel strange and make it feel creepy, but you do get a sense that something normal, something realistic, is being invaded by something supernatural, rather than the supernatural being the entire thing that you exist inside of, the entire world being topsy-turvy.
Yeah, there's a ton of shots of very, very wide, big shots of like the entire room that the actors will be in. And a lot of the time, the room is very large. So you have just kind of the one actor in the very middle of the space doing this kind of like German expressionist acting, like especially Conrad, of course. Because once he starts dealing with his hands, he's constantly like looking at them and with very frightened facial expressions, and he'll always just be like center in the middle of this giant room. Like the most, maybe there'll be the piano next to him or something like that, but it does give this like, I don't know, this overlooming kind of evil that he's dealing with alone, just in this very empty space, and I really liked that.
I like, too, the early shots of him actually just playing, and the shots of his hands and everything like that. Cross cut with the letter that he sent to his wife while he's traveling and doing his doing his performances. That's all like, "My darling, I will be with you. I will run my hands through your hair and feel your body tremble with my hands."
Oh yeah, baby.
I wonder what's going to happen to these hands in a couple minutes.
Yeah,
this man loves his freaking hands.
And something too, like I think when he's first playing the piano, the score is actually quite nice, if I remember correctly. But I will say, as this movie goes, it's not like with Caligari, it did have all those very dark and kind of ominous pianos and stuff like that. But with this, I think throughout the entire runtime, it's just constantly tension. Like even when something kind of romantic is happening, it's undercut by really tense horror strings or really dark piano or something like that. And I just found that to be a really effective decision, because even when it was trying to kind of evoke like romance or something like that, I was constantly brought back into ORLAC's misery with the situation. So yeah, it was really, really good.
I'm
that was one thing I picked up on too.
That we all got. I'm correct in that it's the one that sounds really almost industrial at certain points.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it's in terms of scoring a silent film, I mean, it's baffling, but it also, it works incredibly well in terms of feeling miserable, feeling just incomprehensibly awful.
Yes.
I mean, it's good, but like you just feel just in pain. It's very strange to try to describe to people.
I found myself like just as normal things would happen, like he would just be discovering these kind of uncomfortable feelings with his hands or the odd romance he's having. every single thing felt like it was leading to something absolutely more horrifying because it was constantly tension filled. So even when something normal was happening on the screen, I felt like in 5 minutes something even more terrible is going to happen. It just it evokes fear and discomfort and paranoia, and it's fantastic.
Yeah, and I like your point too about sort of like the intensity of it, because I think that was the thing that makes this that separated this a little bit, you know, in terms of the way that Vine is like approaching Caligari versus approaching this, is that this, as I mentioned, I think in the introduction, even by 1920s standards, this was being written about as like a thriller. That people were like, this is sort of more intensely plotted on like a beat for beat, development for development kind of like scariness, like a quality to that. It has like, even though again it gets into some psychological sort of like schizophrenic stylization, I would say that the writing is just more intense as it's hitting its beats. Yeah. As you are like, oh no, I have the killer's hands. Oh no, you know, is the killer really appearing here? Is he a ghost, or is this, as we, you know, get into some later developments in the film, it becomes what I think has got to be the earliest example I've seen of like a gaslight thriller of like the plotting being that a character is actually driving someone insane rather than anything actually supernatural taking place, which is obviously a little bit different because Caligari blurs that line so much between, you know, the realistic and the supernatural that it's left ambiguous. You're just left with those uncomfortable feelings.
Yeah. In
this, we do get a detailed plot account of where these feelings have been coming from. And how, you know, how the main character has actually been being intentionally driven insane in the plotting of the film.
He also tries to kind of like, you know, kind of trick you throughout as well by having these short sequences of like, there's one where Orlok is in bed and he sees like the giant floating head of the murderer.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Such a great scene.
Yeah, it's insane. And then he also sees, I think, his hand come down and like grab him or something.
A giant
like that.
hand comes into the room.
Yeah,
yep.
so
that's
that, like,
those are
like
the few expressionist gestures for sure.
Right. Yeah, very surreal. And those are moments that definitely lead you to kind of, you know, think that it's going to be supernatural by the end. But he does a good job of still riding that line so that sequence still makes sense, because it could just be, you know, him going through a lot of mental turmoil. So
yeah, the shot way that I would
the way that I would really describe this film in comparison to Caligari, which is why I like it so much, is that Caligari was more of an abstract kind of nightmare.
Yeah.
This is a very, unfortunately, like a real nightmare.
Yeah, very
a living nightmare that you just cannot escape. I mean, there's mutilation, there's faces that look familiar but that you can't recognize, that look sinister, random spats of anger that you can't explain, feeling like something is about to attack you, like it just feels like something that you could dream just on any night, but unfortunately for Orlok, he can't wake up from it.
Yeah,
and
it's
it
every
just
day.
tortures him inside.
Constantly,
and it's great.
When the wife is first seeing him after, you know, he's already had his accident. He's the surgeon. She's begged the surgeon to put, you know, to make sure that he doesn't lose use of just in general his hands.
Yeah, his hands are more important than his life, she says, I think, at one point.
Yes. And when he first wakes up and he's in bed, which is actually the same bed that later we do get the sort of dream sequence of the giant head and hands in the, you know, the shadowy imposing compositions coming down and trying to get him. But there's actually a more subtle one introduced earlier where he just sees the head of the killer looking through the door. And and the killer keeps making appearances, both, you know, sometimes he's in the background of an image like in that, or sometimes, you know, he shows up and he talks to the maid or something like that, and you're led to believe, or the way that he's treated as a figure in the frame, he's kind of treated as sort of like this ghostly spirit that is now haunting this man because of, you know, because the man has his hands, and he's like, you know what? when I was alive, I liked my hands, man. You can't just have them. I use them to do art too. I stabbed the shit out of people.
Artiste.
Yeah. Speaking of which, too, the actual stabbings themselves are actually kind of brutal. Like when they go in and they find his dead dad later in the film, and he just has like the knife sticking out of like his abdomen.
Oh yeah,
it's actually like pretty graphic.
I also really love the shot. There's a shot where Conrad is holding the knife, and it's almost like he's almost becoming one with like the murderer or whatever. He's kind of taking it for a spin in a way, and in the middle of this, once again, it's a giant room, and he's right in the middle of it, and you see the entire room in just this small, well, Conrad, it just looks comparatively small, and he just kind of walks up slowly closer to the front of the frame and just does like stabbing motions, and it's just very it's very scary, and it's almost it's sad in a way too, because I mean, we know that this guy is just like a world-renowned pianist, and now he's in the middle of a room just kind of losing his mind, stabbing the air.
Yeah.
So, you know.
Yeah. Well, and at that point, too, he's like begging the surgeon to like tear his hands off.
Right, exactly. Oh, my God.
And at one point, he's just standing in the room with him, like literally trying to pull his own hands off. And the doctor is like sitting there explaining to him, he's like, dude, the hands don't control you.
Yeah.
Man's mind and heart control the body. Like you're literally just fucking going insane. Like this is your mind. This is not like you're not being possessed by these hands. And the doctor tells him that like 3 times in the movie. And the imagery though is what kind of sells it. It's actually because the imagery is so horrifying. Like these, you know, sort of like surreal supernatural sequences where he is just going insane. You do honestly kind of believe him physically that he is, you know, being possessed. Like during that moment where, you know, you see him with his hands just stabbing the air. That is a moment that you're like, he didn't do that before. So clearly something is happening here, and the imagery is kind of what expresses that to you. And then the film actually, you know, the film is telling you the entire time the actual plot of what is taking place here, which is that he is just going insane. But the imagery does do a good job of selling that insanity as something that could physically be happening to this man.
Yeah, and I am wondering, Josh, have you seen Mad Love, the movie with Peter Lorre? Okay, it was a remake of this movie that they did in the 30s. And I was surprised
with Peter Lorre,
with
like
Peter
the German
Lorre as
actor.
Peter Lorre plays the villain who plays the doctor who puts the hands on Orlok. It runs a bit differently, but I was struck by how different the treatment was in between the remakes, because in this movie, obviously, it's all about the nature of whether or not these hands are actually murderous or whether or not it's all in Orlok's brain. But in Mad Love, there's a scene where he gets the hands and he comes into his dad's office, and Colin Clive, who plays Orlok, is like, my hands, they can stab people now. And he suddenly displays how he's now an expert knife thrower, and that he has no, the hands literally are different, and they do want to kill in this movie. There's no ambiguity at all.
And directed by Carl Frund too, who did the Universal Monsters, The Mummy.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
Interesting.
That's hilarious.
I'm gonna have to check that out now.
Yeah, I definitely will.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I'd have to check them out to see which one kind of like works better for me, because I did appreciate in this that you are kind of left with, again, that ambiguity of not 100% knowing. The imagery saying one thing and the people in the film saying another, which then gets you, you know, to the actual ending where you know, things are revealed, which maybe we'll get to after we talk about a couple scenes here. But a lot of this movie is just him experiencing bizarre supernatural nightmare sequences where he thinks that he is losing control of his own mind and body to these hands. And again, there's also scenes where the wife is seeing the killer appear as like a ghost or an apparition and talking to him. And they also start to introduce a little bit of class elements too, where he realizes that like not being able to, like him being driven insane means that he's not really doing performances anymore, means that they're running out of money. So he has to like, the wife has to like go to his dad for money in like this like creepy ass like cathedral house that the dad has.
Oh God, that's one of my. I mean, two things. One, it's not just that he's going insane; it's also that like he just had a hand transplant. Like you can't play piano, and then he goes to write his name with his new hands, and he finds that his handwriting is just like it looks crude. It looks just. In comparison to the beautiful handwriting we saw at the beginning, like
from his letter, like he doesn't have quite the same skill anymore with these new hands.
It's a new. You literally had new hands implanted on you. It's going to take some time, but of course, because of all the mental turmoil, he thinks that he has the killer's handwriting now. Like the killer can't play piano, so how can I play piano? But then the second thing, I mean, God, that one of my favorite scenes in the film, just because of how the atmosphere is directed, because I mean I hate to keep comparing it to Mad Love because I'm just struck by how different the approaches are, even though they're from the same source material. In Mad Love, the dad is kind of, he scoffs, but he's played like a normal guy. In this, I mean, the dad lives in this giant cathedral in the middle of the room. He has someone near him, but he just stands stoic. He sits stoic in a chair.
It reminded me of
wife to come in. Yeah,
it kind of reminded me of like the king and Wormtongue in the Lord of the Rings a little bit. Just because that guy's right behind kind of the chair. Yeah, and he's just I can't remember if he says anything to him, but the dad has this almost like zombie like presence to him, and then there's this man that's just behind him, shoulder height, and the imagery reminded me very much of the Lord of the Rings and Wormtongue.
And he absolutely hates his son. Like the wife is like begging, him for financial help, and she goes, he is your flesh and blood. Would you really, let him be ground into the earth? And he says, yes, I would love that.
He's honest.
And
complete other, like he exists just outside the fold of morality. He just seems like he's a figure just built out of evil. It's great.
And you are kind of left to wonder if him and the space that he occupies is being distorted by their fears and paranoia, or if this, because it is one of the like more expressionist and unrealistic things that take place in the film, like compared to a lot of the scenes building up to that, other than the sequences where like the killer is starting to reveal himself or haunt them, where he's starting to have nightmare sequences. Like there's no performance, I think, quite as animated as the father in that moment. But it turns out that like shortly after that, I think he goes to talk to his father, and his father has been found stabbed to death. And it sort of implies that he might have killed him because of these feelings of fear and rage that were brought up in this conversation, that maybe he sort of subconsciously channeled that into his own physical actions, and that he thinks maybe that he was the one who killed his father. And then also it's killed in the same way that the previous killer who had been executed killed, by like leaving the dagger with like a very specific like X mark on it, signed, and so
and it has his fingerprints. It has the killer's fingerprints on it, and who has Vasur's the serial killer's fingerprints now? It's Orlok, because he literally has those hands. Who else could it be?
Yes. Yeah, so everything is being designed for him to, lose his sense of who he is and what he's capable of doing. And needless to say, he eventually meets up with the ghost man, who appears, in the flesh, and asks him for his inheritance money that he's about to receive from, you know, his father who was just killed. And I think it's like essentially he's saying, you know, I am the killer, and you can see, like, you know, he lifts up like these gold gloves to show that he has like fake hands.
Yeah, like iron hands.
That the surgeon actually replaced, you know, who they actually executed instead with me, so that I could escape. And, you know, for payment for, you know, gifting ORLAC his hands, he's like, you need to give me all of, you know, this money that you're about to come into. And that the surgeon, you know, was involved in all of this and helped him avoid execution. And he's the one who's been framing him by, you know, using his fingerprints. And essentially he ends up like kind of trying to go to the cops, and they don't really like they don't believe him, but then eventually they do believe him. There's some weird sort of like expository plot developments made in the last bit that involves also the maid showing up and revealing the end all truth.
Yeah,
of it
because
all.
they got to explain all the supernatural elements now in a very realistic way. Which I will say,
but even in the realistic way, it makes no sense.
Well, oh yeah, definitely.
No, it's insane.
Well, see, that's honestly what made me continue to kind of love this film, because I was hoping for a more like ambiguous kind of supernatural ending, in a sense, where we still don't quite know, or something more along that line. But because it goes to this incredibly almost goofy explanation of things, and there's so many layers to it, I appreciated it, and I had a lot of fun with it by the end, so it worked for me.
Oh yeah, well, I mean it
yeah, well, I mean, I just want to do a brief tangent about this.
For sure.
Robert Vine, he has, I mean, I haven't seen Crime and Punishment or his other adaptations yet, but what I've noticed is that Vine has this almost severe allergic reaction to, he deals with supernatural a ton, but he has a allergic reaction to accepting it as an actual real thing that is concrete in his films. And it's all about mind over matter. And I know it all kind of came through to me when I found out about a film that he made just a year before this called INRI. The film just kind of astounded me with the plot, because I've never heard of a film before that presented Judas as the protagonist and the hero in a story about Jesus Christ. And the whole thing, and it's this big production, and the whole thing is that his idea is that Judas did not sell out Jesus because he wanted a few pieces of silver, and that he was willing to sell out the Son of God because he was so evil. He fell out of favor because he disagreed with Jesus politically, and that he disagreed with the direction that he was taking as the leader of the rebellion against the Romans. And he connected it with a frame story about anarchism in Russia versus Lenin and the communists. And it's very, it kind of became clear to me that he is a real materialist. He really does not believe in religion or the supernatural or anything. And all the horror can come from within, but in the end, everything outside, it's all real. It's all of that terror comes from your mind, and it can really overtake you in that way. And I found that really, really fascinating.
Oh yeah, that's definitely true. He definitely reads it like that. That was great.
Yeah, well, and you know the way that in ORLAC he kind of complicates that by having someone abuse someone else's feelings about believing in supernatural. Because like that's what the eventual killer in this film, it's revealed he's not really the killer, but he's actually just a blackmailer. And he's set up this giant elaborate ruse where somehow he like pulled the killer's fingerprints by like having the surgeon make gloves out of his hand.
Oh yeah, baby.
I mean, also, but I mean, at the time, I think hand transplants didn't even exist at this point, like actually in the medical field. But also, he wants to claim to Veidt's character that, oh yeah, I got a head transplant. I'm on a completely different body right now. And Veidt, of course, he's sold. Like, I believe anything at this point. Like, that's terrifying. That's great.
Yeah, surgical transplants did exist, but they were pretty new. And people definitely weren't doing them, I think, as far as, like, I don't know if they were doing full-out hands at that point, but, like, it was definitely mining, like, a real fear and paranoia had about, like a new thing that people were talking about.
Yeah, when the two moves that I was just losing myself on is when he unstraps the, like, iron gloves to reveal that he just has hands underneath, and they were just like metal gloves of some sort. And then the best one, though, is what you were just kind of talking about with the head thing. He has this, like, fake stitching on his neck, and he pulls it off, like, ta-da, it's this elaborate thing. It was, oh my god, I lost my mind. I thought that was the funniest shit.
So when the cops come to get him, he's like, actually, I'm really just a blackmailer, so, like, that's not as severe of a crime as being a killer. And then he points at him and says, he's really the killer because he's got the hands and you found the fingerprints on the knife. Like, that's really the guy. So then you need the maid to come in and, explain that, he actually got the fingerprints by, like, making gloves out of it and of the killer and things like that. The funniest element of all of this is because we're obviously laughing because
it's just so wild.
The plot developments are incredibly goofy.
This all happens in like 20 minutes, maybe not even.
Yeah, and the majority of the film is just this really dark, like just emotional turmoil that this guy's going through, and then all of a sudden the last 20 minutes is like a big Scooby-Doo episode or something.
where they reveal who was behind it the entire time, and which is interesting because I personally haven't seen a gaslight thriller older than this, so I'm curious if like that's like if there are other movies that have done that kind of plot point before. But the absolute funniest detail that I read while researching the film is that they actually tried to ban and censor this film, and I think in some places they actually did get that done.
Wow.
Because the governments and the police thought that it was going to, it was going to make public, the idea of like trying to take fingerprints, and it was going to give killers like ideas about things that they could do, and that it was going to be tried. It was about deceiving the police, and it was highly unsuitable was the words that they used.
Oh man, that's hilarious. You're going to teach the criminals too much.
Yeah, even though they eventually took it to like experts who said that no, this is completely insane and unrealistic.
There's no way this can happen.
We are not. Yeah, they eventually concluded that everything that is included in the last like 5 minutes of the movie there is pure fantasy and insanity. Yeah.
That's awesome.
But the fact that they were initially worried, that they were initially like, wow, this is going to help killers frame people by using other people's fingerprints.
This is really dark. Oh my god, that's amazing.
So yeah, but even though that stuff is ultimately kind of the expository finale is ultimately kind of silly, one element that I still think really ends up working about this film and what really took it over the top for me is the last shot of the movie, because after expository element is like all done and you do realize that technically his hands are now his, and everything that has been haunting him has been him sort of just reacting to someone trying to drive him insane and trying to frame him as a killer. But at the end, when he leaves with his wife and they've sort of escaped the situation, you just get this really intense close-up shot of him embracing his wife and his hands just all over her face, while they're embracing each other. And you are left with that impression of like, earlier in the film, he was stabbing with those hands. Yeah, maybe he wasn't killing anyone, but but those really were the hands of someone who used them to kill. And he did seem like at for destruction versus art.
Right.
And so to end, it does achieve a tiny bit of ambiguity again by the end of the film, when you're just left with all of the ways that hands have been made to feel kind of scary and wrong. Even just the giant hand appearing in his room and trying to grab him.
Yeah.
Hands have been made a little bit scarier just by the way that he's made the film. So watching what is supposed to be this moment of relief and love at the end of the film, and you're kind of sitting there going like, please take those hands off of her face.
Hope that doesn't go down from her cheeks to her neck there, buddy.
Yeah. Which is just a really, really great ending. I loved that.
Yeah, me too.
But yeah, maybe once again pivoting towards the reductive rating round on the Hands of Orlok. This one got the solid 4 from me. I think I definitely prefer just the overall visual style of Caligari to this, but I think there's a lot to really like about this. The overall sort of like, again, the intensity of the way that the plot is kind of like drawn out, merged with the psychologically supernatural and sort of schizophrenic horror imagery that he populates that with. The combination of those two things, I think, do work well in tandem, and they do create a little bit of subjectivity once again with Conrad that I did find myself kind of getting swept up into. Like when it gets into those sequences where he's having dreams about the killer's face floating around his room and stuff like that. Like, even though by the end of the film you do find out that it was all, imaginary, you are still left with the idea of what someone's imagination, can make their body do. Like, I am struck by the way that contrasts with the scene that Jamie was talking about early on, where he's just standing in a room stabbing the air because he's been inspired to do so by these supernatural sequences. And that element I did find very creepy, and it translates all the way into the last shot of the film. So solid 4 for me.
Yeah, solid 4 for me as well. This was, once again, even the kind of craziness that comes with the ending, I just really appreciated and still had a lot of fun with. I think it would have been more, effective and scary if they kept some of those supernatural moments happening throughout the film. But once again, had a lot of fun with that ending, so I'm okay with it. But I really love, especially in the first half of the movie, the use of big giant spaces and having Conrad just, dead center in these huge rooms, just kind of alone, and then at times, like Josh said, stabbing the air, just really going through some real emotional and mental turmoil. It was just very effective to use those spaces in that way. And once again, the score, the tensity of the score is just unbelievable. It really never lets up, even when there's a moment of kind of, I don't want to say relaxation, but like when there's an attempt at romance or something like that. There's still this underlying score where you're just like, you feel like something is coming constantly, something bad, and that was great. I loved that. So yeah, this was a 4 out of 5, and once again, I mean, Conrad just knocks it out of the park. I love this actor. I don't know how many films he's done that are like super well known besides like the big popular ones. Like, have you guys seen any other Conrad films? Besides, like...
I have.
Okay. Is there another one that would be just like, you absolutely should see this? Because I really love this actor.
Ooh, 2, I think you've already seen The Man Who Laughs, but...
Yeah, great.
The Man Who Laughs is one of those essential ones, but a lesser-known one that I think everybody should see just for historical significance sake. He made his major film debut with a film called Different from the Others, which was the world's first pro-gay film ever made.
Cool.
He plays a gay violinist who also displays a ton of inner tumult, suicidal tendencies, really just kind of world-weary, and he does there's only a fragment of it that exists that's I think about like 50 or so minutes long, but he does a amazing performance that really knocks it out of the park.
Wow, 1919 as well. That's great.
Yeah, it's way old, but that's how it used to be for a while.
Yeah.
And Yeah, I mean, he does great performances in pretty much everything, but those are the two, other than these two that I've mentioned, that you should really see if you can. And I think Different from the Others is on YouTube right now. But yeah, for me, I would also give this a 4 out of 5, maybe a 4.5 out of 5, just because the ending, as much as we all laughed about talking about it, how insane and absurd it is, it does take away a bit because it's so expository and all these different things, but it's so rich in subject matter. I mean, obviously, as we talked about, Veidt, fantastic, pulls the whole film together just on his performance alone. Just the visual effects as well, however slight they might be, they really add something to it. The production design, even though it's not as fantastical as Caligari, obviously, it still provides that atmosphere of just creepiness and spookiness a lot. It's great. It's great. It's wonderful. I recommend it a lot.
All right, I think that will wrap it up for everything this week. That was The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari from 1920 and The Hands of Orlak from 1924. Thanks so much, Séamus, for joining us and for bringing these films with you and forcing us to finally go back to the silent era.
Yeah, it was awesome.
We hadn't done it yet. This is the part of the show, Séamus, where if you got anything to plug, we usually have you do that.
Oh, I do have something to plug. This is completely separate from the subject matter that we talked about. But if you are interested in Middle Eastern affairs, trying to get informed about the global South and what's happening there, I do have a Substack that you can subscribe to. Malekafzali at .substack.com. MALEKAFZALI.substack.com. $5 a month, get access to articles about Iranian politics, Gulf Arab affairs, Israeli-Palestinian conflict, crisis in Bolivia, all these different things. It's all there. Would love if you supported it.
Awesome. Hell yeah. For our listeners, we are going to be back in 1 week's time. We're continuing, actually, off of Séamus's silent film picks. We are going to be talking about what is probably my personal favorite silent era horror film. We're going to be talking about Haxon.
Oh, yeah.
From 1922. As well as we're going to continue the theme from Haxon, which is witchcraft. And we're going to talk about another well-known sort of witchcraft film. We're going to be talking about 1960s The City of the Dead with Christopher Lee in that one.
Oh, yeah.
So we're going to talk a little bit of more silent era horror, and then we're going to merge it with some kind of more Hammer horror era filmmaking. And The City of the Dead in particular, it's kind of like if Psycho was about witchcraft. It's kind of nuts.
Yeah, dead on.
And then the week after, we're going to be joined by special guest Sam Zimmerman, who some of you might know as the director of programming at the streaming service Shudder that focuses all on genre and horror films. And we're going to be talking with him about a film called Let's Scare Jessica to Death.
Awesome.
Which we'll jump into that one when we actually get on the episode because it's a hard one to describe, but I've seen it. It's very good. And then we're also going to be talking about The Legend of Hell House.
Oh, cool.
Which is by John Hugh or Ho. I can't remember exactly how to say his name, but the director of programming at Shudder, Sam Zimmerman, he knows his horror films, so I'm trusting him. This is going to be a really fun double feature.
Yeah, that's awesome. Sounds good.
But that's what you guys can expect in 2 weeks' time. That'll be the free episode. But yeah, that being said, I think that wraps it up for everything this week. Thanks so much, guys, for listening, and keep it sleazy.
Keep it sleazy.